Good morning, everybody. So in the next 20 minutes or so, what I would try to do is to give us a little background about the environment in which journalists actually have to work today when we're talking about conflicts in general and about the media coverage of terrorism in particular. So thinking about conflicts today, we know that the nature of conflicts has pretty much remained the same from biblical days. Actually, a little anecdote about that. I have twin boys at home. When they started studying the Bible, I don't know, it was almost like 5 years ago, one of my boys came home and said, Mom, you know, when we're reading the Bible, it's kind of like what you're doing, researching the media coverage of conflict. So I asked him, what do you mean? He says, in each chapter, we're learning about a conflict. And then all it says at the end of the chapter is that it was quiet for 40 years, and then we're moving on to the next episode. And again, they're fighting. So basically, that's kind of like the media coverage of conflicts, or media coverage in general. We're focusing a lot about conflicts, not so much about other things. But when we're thinking about conflict, the nature of conflicts has pretty much remained the same since forever. People are fighting about the same things, resources, beliefs, and so on. But when we're thinking about the character of conflicts, it had changed dramatically in the last few decades. And I want to focus a little bit about two major changes that underwent in the last few decades or so. So the first significant change is that we moved from what we call symmetrical warfare to asymmetrical warfare. We used to have, until basically a little after World War II, conflicts that used to be between countries or between nations, between armies. It's something that our students mostly watch on movies today. It's not conflicts that we know firsthand, luckily. But a lot of conflicts today are what we are calling asymmetric conflicts or hybrid conflicts. We have different names for those. And we have militarized non-state actors fighting mostly states. And it's something that happens in many areas around the world. The Middle East, unfortunately, is a very good example for that. Another change that we had witnessed had to do with technological developments, as Noam had mentioned. And due to technological developments, due to other reasons as well, political reasons and other reasons as well, we shifted from a situation in which we used to receive very limited information from war zones, from conflicts all over the world, to a situation in which we're kind of like flooded with information. Now we have too much information. We can't always screen the information to know what's real, what's not. But looking at traditional media, social media, all of that together, we're living in a situation in which we receive a lot of information about conflict. So basically, if we'll take those two variables, we can see that we have different types of conflicts, but I won't waste too much time on that because most conflicts today are actually what we call information space conflicts. Conflicts that are asymmetric conflicts in the sense of the actors that take place in the conflict. And they used to usually receive extensive media coverage, or we receive a lot of information from those war zones. So since we're talking about an asymmetric conflicts, when we're imagining an asymmetric conflict, we have a country which is very powerful. It has airplanes and submarines and maybe nukes and other types of weapons. And it's usually fighting a non-state militarized actor, which is smaller, kind of like this tiny, maybe 7-year-old fighting this sumo fighter. How long do you think it will take this sumo fighter to crush this child? Seconds, right? But will he do it or not? That's the big question. Will he do it?
Probably not.
Probably not. Why not?
It's a child.
Because it's a child. What would we think about this huge sumo fighter if he would actually crush a child? come on, it's an unbalanced conflict. It's in Hebrew we say lo kochot. It's not balanced. It's not something we would think that is unmoral. He's acting in a way that we can't really defend. Now, this picture that was taken actually in the first Intifada in Israel in the end of the 1980s is basically the same situation. We have, so instead of the sumo fighter, the child is still the child, is a little older and holding a rock. But instead of the sumo fighter, we have a tank. That's basically the same situation. Now, there are a lot of restraints that prevents states from achieving. I have a hard time with the word victory, but I haven't found a different one yet, because I don't think we can really achieve victory in today's conflict. But getting to some achievements in those types of conflicts. And one of the most important constraints that countries have to deal with has to do with public opinion, both internal and external. And when we're thinking about the fact that the camera was there, that actually a lot of what prevents countries from achieving success in those types of conflicts. There's a really good book about it by Gil Marom called Why States Lose Small Wars. That's basically it. He gives us a lot of reasons, but I want to focus a little bit about public opinion. So we understand that the fact that it's being broadcast all over the world, whether it's through traditional media or you get it through your feed on Facebook or in tweets that you see, you're actually becoming part of the conflict. And because when we're looking at this child, all we want to do is defend him. Because if we don't have any strong feelings towards any of those sides in a conflict, when we see a child suffering, all we want to do is hug him and defend him and make sure he's going to be okay. So that's basically what the camera does for us. So we need to take into consideration that today's conflicts actually occurs in different arenas. We have the military battlefield that is there, sadly will always be there, and we need to keep on achieving successes in that arena. But on top of that, we have a diplomatic battlefield, we have a media battlefield, and we have a legal battlefield. Now, all of them we need to have successes in all of them in order to be victorious, although I told you victory is a difficult word in today's conflict. I would argue that the big challenge is to actually find the balance between the military battlefield and the media battlefield. Because if I would win on the media battlefield, if I would be perceived as the just side, the moral side, the side that everybody can relate to and want to support, then I wouldn't have diplomatic issues, because who wouldn't support the just side? No Western country would go against the moral side that acts according to what is expected from westernized countries these days. And same for legal issues. The International Court of Law doesn't work when you are perceived as the moral side. So basically, we need to find the right balance between the military battlefield and the media battlefield. And that is the biggest challenge, I think, for countries today. Because if I want to win on the military battlefield, I need to use as much force as I can. That's how we win militarily. But if I use too much power, then I would have an image problem on the media battlefield. And when we're talking about the media battlefield, and Israel is actually a country that suffers a lot from that, extensive use of force is one of the biggest issues while covering terrorism in the international news media, especially for Israel. So finding the right balance between the military battlefield and the media battlefield is a huge challenge for in today's conflicts. So basically, I'm here to convince you that we're talking about an image war. Alongside the military confrontation, there's an image war going on in which each side tries to justify its actions and make us identify with them. And political actors actually invest a lot of time and resources in doing so. Some of it is being done through public diplomacy, some of that is being done through strategic communication, but it's something that all political actors, including terror organizations, take into account when they plan their strategy and when they try to communicate messages. So basically, as I said, we have an image war going on. And when we're talking about conflicts, usually we talk about the military front, the international front, and in recent years we also have the home front. And the image war plays a significant part in all of that. About a week and a half ago, there was a little issue in the northern border, right, very near to where I live, very close to my kibbutz, between Hezbollah and the IDF. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with that incident, but the IDF made Hezbollah believe that, a rocket shot by Hezbollah actually wounded some Israeli soldiers, and a couple of hours later they say, no, it didn't, we just fooled you. Because a lot of today's conflicts is actually about perceptions. Now, the reason I'm mentioning it is because we can see how it works in all fronts. The image war actually has, it influences the actions of the soldiers, of the decision makers during conflicts as well. Internationally, we all understand that the image of the different sides has a strong influence on how we will perceive the different sides, how much we'll support them, how much we will criticize them. It can even go to sanctions and other issues as well. But even in the home front, the reason that the IDF had to go back from its initial statement, or it wasn't really an official statement, that some soldiers were wounded, was due to Israeli public opinion pressures. We cannot fool our own people. So they had to find the right balance to do so. I'm not sure if they did it correctly, but they did it anyway. We need to understand that today there's a battle of ideas or of narratives going on top of the military battlefield. So when we're talking about information space conflicts, we need to understand that borders are irrelevant. We can measure borders when we're talking about the military battlefield, but when we're talking about the image war, even if I sit in my house in Cincinnati, Ohio, and read a tweet about something that happened in Syria, I'm actually becoming part of the conflict. Because I can write my congressmen or my senators, I can protest, I can post about it, I can try to influence others. And when we're talking about image war, geographical borders are less relevant. Another thing we need to take into consideration is that when I spoke earlier about asymmetry, we all assumed that the country is the stronger adversary, that the country is the more powerful adversary when we're talking about a conflict. But I would actually argue that when we're talking about the media coverage, this weaker side is the stronger side. They have a better story to sell, and they actually, while using the media, they try to balance the conflict by receiving supportive and trying to make other international forces take part in the conflict and somewhat balance the power play between the actors. So while talking about the media, we are actually witnessing a reverse asymmetry. The weaker side is the stronger side. And it actually has to do with my last point here on the slide, is that in today's Western media, we're talking about a narrative of compassion. As I told you before, when we watched this little child with the rock or the child with the sumo fighter, all we wanted to do is go and hug him and defend him and make sure he's okay. That's basically what the Western media wants to do today. We are identifying with the weaker side. We're identifying with those we can help or save. That's a lot of what the Western media is focusing on these days. And that's especially true when we're talking about social media. And in social media, the weaker adversaries actually have a huge advantages because they can use it. I used to say that it's free, it's easy, it's accessible, and then ISIS came and spent so much money on doing that. So even if it's free, you can do it for a lot of money. but it's really easy for the weaker adversaries that are less dependent on institutions to promote their messages as they see fit while using social media. And we know that it works better for the weaker adversaries that previously didn't have that much accessibility to promote their messages on the traditional media. So I'm talking about an image war. I'm talking about image in the general sense, but let's talk about visual images for a second. Visual images has a significant impact on the way we think, on the way we perceive reality. Think about it in the sense of today's fake news era or deep fake videos as we're starting to witness. But when we're watching those videos and we have pictures, and we have a lot of those from different conflicts and different time frames here, you should understand that when we're watching a video or a picture, it kind of like we sensed it ourselves. So it has a significant implications on the way we perceive the conflict, who's the bad side, who's the good side, and how we're moving along with that. I'll skip that because Rona is giving me you need to finish up. So I said that we're going to focus a little bit about terrorism, so I'll do that for the few minutes that I got left. In the 1970s, mostly, political communication scholars, and one of them is here, Professor Gabi Weimann, as mentioned before, started to learn about or examine the connection between terrorism and media, and they came to realize that actually terrorists take media considerations while planning their attacks, and they call this notion the theater of terror, because terrorists are actually kind of like producers or actors, putting on a show for us, for the international news media, and for all of us watching at home. So they have their immediate casualties, and they're important, but what's more important is actually spreading fear, which is the notion of terrorism. So they're planning their attacks to get as much media coverage as possible. So we saw it in the Munich Olympics in 1972. And as I already said, ISIS took it to a whole different level, because ISIS didn't only produce the events through social media and very sophisticated usage of social media, they also produced the media coverage of the events. And that's something that we need to keep in mind. And the traditional media, which is competing on us, actually, the audience, couldn't stay away and decide not to cover those types of stories. So we see how it affects them. Terrorists also became legitimate sources for journalists and from media outlets in general, and that's something that we need to take into consideration. They're kind of like celebrities of the conflict world, if you will. Another dilemma that I want to add to what Noam had mentioned before is the dilemma between our right to know and the fact that when we're talking about journalism a lot, about terrorism a lot on the traditional media and in specific ways, we're actually kind of like promoting terrorism. So that's something that we need to keep in mind, that that's an open question for all the journalists here in the room. And I was speaking in Mike's seminar here at the IDC a couple of weeks ago, and I told them that I don't want to trade seats with them. That's a hard question to answer, and it's even harder to do that in reality, but I think that it's something that we need to keep in mind. And Noam actually already touched upon embedded journalism, and Noam said that we need to take into consideration that when a journalist is embedded within a fighting unit, he actually tells us their narrative. It's actually not something that is being demanded of him. It's kind of natural. He identifies with them, he feels part of them, and that's how the coverage looks like. But one notion that I wanted to add to that was that in today's reality, and for a while now actually, journalists also are being not exactly embedded, but joining terror organizations and covering the story through their eyes. A good example of that was the Second Lebanon War. 30 journalists had joined the Hezbollah tour, and only one of them reported that it was a Hezbollah tour. All the rest of the reporters actually reported as if it was news. and it's something that I think we need to take into consideration while talking about ethics. So if World War I was more unsophisticated guns and we move to a more sophisticated one, the next big thing has to do with the way we perceive reality with the camera, and it's actually fueled by money, so something to think about. Thank you.